Welcome to Speaking Territory, a podcast by School of International Relations and Strategic Studies, University of Mumbai. Today we have a special guest with us, Dr. Sameer Patil. Thank you so much, sir, for taking out time and joining us today, and it's an honor to have you with us. So, Dr. Sameer Patil is a senior fellow at ORF Mumbai, an alumnus of Jawaharlal Nehru University. He holds a PhD in international relations. Sameer Patil is a former fellow in the National Security Studies program, Gateway House. His work focuses on the intersection of technology and national security, including cybersecurity. Prior to his stint at Gateway House, he served as an assistant director at the National Security Council Secretariat in Prime Minister's Office, New Delhi, where he handled counter-terrorism and national security desk. Dr. Patil is the author of Securing India in Cyber Era and has co-edited Moving Forward EU-India Relations, the significance of secure dialogues. He is also a dissertation advisor at the Naval War College, Goa. In 2019, he was a recipient of the Canberra Fellowship awarded by the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, Australia. After the 2008 Mumbai attacks, Dr. Patil took part in many Track 1 and Track 1.5 discussions, including the India-US and India-UK Strategic Intelligence Dialogues and the India-UK Track 1.5 Cyber Dialogue. So my first question to you will be, like you have served as the assistant director at the National Security Council Secretariat in the Prime Minister's office from 2008 to 13. So can you please elaborate on how counterterrorism and cybersecurity measures taken by India have changed since that time? And how are the concerns then different from the concerns now? Also, has the pandemic affected national security to a great extent with the increase in cyber attacks?
So, first of all, thank you so much for inviting me to be on this podcast. I just had a look at some of the previous episodes of this initiative. I think it's great, that you are connecting with the experts and also giving us the opportunity to present our views to the community of the students. And therefore, thank you so much for inviting me to be part of it. And now, coming to your question about cybersecurity and counterterrorism concerns from my days in the National Security Council Secretariat, I would say that looking at the issue of cybersecurity itself, uh, when I was there, I would say that cybersecurity was an emerging concern on India's threat landscape. Uh, we saw in 2010 how the infections caused by the Stuxnet virus, which was supposed to target the Iranian nuclear program, but that virus traveled through many countries, including India, and caused infections in many countries. So in India, there were a couple of infections of the critical infrastructure systems at ONGC, as well as some of the water management and energy systems. But beyond that, there was not that much a major infection. But nonetheless, that sensitized the Indian policymakers about the need to protect our critical infrastructure. Now, critical infrastructure is something which needs to be operational 24/7, and any disruption of that particular service can have implications for the welfare of the society, economy, as and therefore the country as such. So in 2014, the government set up the National Critical Information Infrastructure Protection Center, or the NCIIPC, and that was one of the first steps that the government took towards India's cybersecurity. A year before that, we had the National Cybersecurity Policy, so which was like an umbrella document setting out the guidelines for the various cybersecurity initiatives in the country. Today, of course, cybersecurity has become a critical element of national security, and we have seen the right from the Prime Minister an emphasis on securing India in this cyber era. Not to mention the fact that today we are the second largest internet user base in the world. We have with 700 million internet users. And many of these internet users are the first generation internet users. So many of them actually lack a know-how of what to do and what not to do when it comes to the cyberspace, because they're using the internet for the first time. And of course, our adversaries have also become very advanced in their cyber capabilities. So we have had penetrating attacks coming from the Chinese state-sponsored hackers as well as the Pakistani hackers, and that is itself a step up of some of the nuisance value attacks that used to carry a decade ago. So, which means that our cybersecurity, our cyber threat landscape today has become much more complicated because of these penetrating attacks coming from Pakistan and China. And we also seen some of the non-state actors figuring in our threat landscape. So, for instance, we have seen the Pakistan-based anti-India terrorist groups such as Lashkar-e-Taiba and Jaish-e-Mohammed using the cyberspace for carrying out their activities. We have seen the use of the cyberspace for recruitment and propaganda by the Islamic State, which I prefer to call as the Daesh terrorist group. So obviously, so all those factors also complicate our cybersecurity landscape. Now, linking this to counterterrorism is what I would say is that one of the big phenomena which was not present when I was there in the National Security Council Secretariat was the social media. Social media was just emerging on the scene at that time, but today social media served as our primary communication with the outside world. And as I said, that the terrorist groups are now using social media for their activities such as recruitment and propaganda. Uh, Now, after the 2008 Mumbai attacks, one of the first things that came to the attention of the Indian security establishment, even though they had kept a watch on it for a very long time, was the fact that many of the Pakistan-based groups had taken shelter in India's neighborhood, especially in countries such as Nepal and Bangladesh. So even as the glare was on the terrorist infrastructure in Pakistan, Indian security agencies worked with their counterparts in Nepal and Bangladesh to dismantle those terrorist networks and therefore deny those groups that safe haven in some of those countries. Uh, the other thing that we also saw, as I said, the rise of the Islamic State from 2013 and 14 onwards, basically out of spirit of Al Qaeda. Now, that itself was a significant challenge because for the first time we had a group which was not associated with Al Qaeda, had a different ideology than Al Qaeda, but and was operating in a different territory, which was Syria and Iraq, and was using social media prolifically, which was again not exactly a characteristic of Al Qaeda's modus operandi. So that was itself a huge challenge, which for the Indian security establishment, because then radicalization emerged as a big concern. And today we are seeing, the rise in the lone wolf kind of operatives, the terrorist suspect or terrorists who actually operate on their own because they have got self-radicalized by looking at this extremist material on the internet. So that I think is now remains a defining characteristic of India's counterterrorism challenge: this lone wolf and the radicalization caused by the Islamic State. Uh, of course, if you look at the security situation in Jammu and Kashmir, if you compare it to a decade ago, we had many terrorist groups operating there. Today, also, those groups are operating, Hizbul Mujahideen, Lashkar-e-Taiba, and Jaish-e-Mohammed, but their ability to carry out terrorist attacks has significantly diminished because of the sustained crackdown by the security forces. So that the security situation in JNK also is, in a sense, a big change from my days in the National Security Council Secretariat. And coming to a final point about whether the pandemic has, in a sense, led to the complication of cybersecurity scenarios. Indeed, it has, because we saw a mass shift to a working from home kind of model, or the WFH model. So that, in a sense, posed challenges in terms of endpoint security, because many of these employees actually used to work on the company computers in the office, where the IT team or the cybersecurity team was in charge of the devices security in terms of antivirus, firewalls, and those kind of things, encryption and all that. But suddenly we saw a shift in the on these home systems, which many of which were not exactly had those kind of firewalls, had no encryption, as well as the not updated antivirus software. So that meant that opened a new vulnerability in terms of India's cybersecurity posture. And we have already seen National Security Advisor Ajit Doval mentioning that there was a significant rise in cyber attacks targeting the critical infrastructure and defense infrastructure during the pandemic period. So that means that during this entire period of pandemic, we have seen India's cybersecurity challenges getting further complicated.
Rightly said, sir. I really agree on this with you. So, as we discussed, contemporarily we are facing the perils of non-traditional military challenges. And in this regard, what are your thoughts on wars of the future? And what do you think about restructuring the Indian armed forces in such a way that country can meet these challenges?
So if you see the current developments in Ukraine, you will realize how technology is playing a very critical role in today's warfare. And I think technology will define the future of warfare from today on, from this period onwards. And I think there will be more focus on the artificial intelligence enabled systems such as drones, swarm drones, robots, and those kind of things, which in a sense would mean that they will not be used. They will be used not just in the war fighting, but also to do other kinds of tasks which are typical of a military. For instance, surveillance. For instance, bomb diffusion and those kind of things. And I think that will now become, in a sense, will mean that you will have more human power, more human resources being released for the actual fighting. And there also we would actually see that given the aversion to the deaths on the battlefield, especially in the Western countries, we will see more robots into the battlefield because then that risk of the human casualties and the deaths and injuries will in a sense go away. What we'll also see is the elements of hybrid warfare. Now, hybrid warfare essentially is defined by the fact that it uses advanced technology. So you can look at, for instance, the artificial intelligence-enabled systems such as drones and robots as kind of advanced technologies. We also see more emphasis on disinformation and propaganda. Again, if you see what is happening in Ukraine, you will see how the Russian propaganda and the Ukrainian propaganda is trying to create their own narrative about what is actually happening on the battlefield, where the Ukrainian forces are claiming victory in some areas, whereas Russian forces are claiming victory over Ukraine, and those kind of things as well. So I think that will, in a sense, also become much more pronounced. And the third feature of this hybrid warfare is actually the use of proxies. Now, that is again something which we have seen in Ukraine, for instance, where Ukraine, for instance, had invited a lot of the foreign fighters to come and join the Ukrainian war effort. And we also saw from the Russian side how they use some of the separatist forces in the Ukrainian territory to actually fight the Ukrainian forces. So I think hybrid warfare will, in a sense, will define the future of warfare. Now, what it means for India is that we'll have to fight the battles. We cannot fight the battles in silos. So today, if we look at the domain of the battlefield, the battlefield domain, traditionally speaking, we had seen the air domain, the land domain, and the naval domain as the three domains. But now we have the emergence of cyber and space domains also, which means that any military which thinks of fighting a battle will have to now fight across the domains and across these theaters. So there is now more emphasis on jointness, and that is something which India has been doing, has been trying to do in the last few years. If you see the appointment of the Chief of Defense Staff, late General Bipin Rawat, and his efforts to actually create these joint commands, that in a sense indicates that India is undertaking that effort. We already have three joint commands: the Defense Cyber Agency, the Defense Space Agency, and the Andaman and Nicobar Command. So those are, in a sense, the joint commands, what we call as the tri-service commands, which bring together all the three forces of the Indian military under one operational head. So we have seen that. We also seen, for instance, the move to dismantle some of the commands themselves. So, for instance, we know so we'll be now transitioning from the Army's Northern Command, or for instance, the Indian Navy's the Western Naval Command, to a theater, to theaterization. So we'll have, for instance, the Southern Theater, Western Theater, which will again bring together all the three elements of the Indian military. So that is in response to this changing nature of warfare that we are seeing. Uh, the second thing that the Indian military is doing is induction of more autonomous platforms. We've already seen much effort in terms of integrating the drones into our military inventory, and they are being primarily used for reconnaissance and surveillance purpose, particularly in the border areas, as well as if you see Indian Navy also using these long-range maritime surveillance drones. Uh, Recently, there were also reports that India is actually now Indian Army has also inducted the swarming drones for the reconnaissance purpose in the border areas with Pakistan and China. So that, in a sense, indicates, that we are now laying emphasis on the autonomous systems, and our Defense Research and Development Organization, the DRDO, is also undertaking various research initiatives to go deep into these kind of technologies and how they can be utilized further. And much of this actually, also stems from what China is doing. Since 2015, China's People's Liberation Army has been undergoing a lot of intense military reforms, and India is also looking at that particular experiment and learning lessons from that. Uh, the last part of this is actually, the utilization of what we call as the startup and the innovation ecosystem, and that is something which again we are realizing that, that world over there is a move to induct private sector into the defense research. So no longer the state-owned bodies or state-backed bodies are doing the defense research, and they're no longer being treated as like a restricted kind of a domain, but we are now inviting the startups and the other innovation ecosystem that we have uh, to actually innovate some of the technologies that the Indian military needs, because many of these technologies, require an out-of-box thinking, and typically speaking, startups and the innovators actually demonstrate that kind of an attitude. So we are also doing that in terms of harnessing that particular potential for our own defense technologies, and ultimately the aim, as we have seen repeatedly from the policymakers, is to actually attain the self-reliance in defense production, because again that is something which is one of the fundamental key learnings of all this, is that unless a nation is self-reliant in defense production and defense manufacturing, that will still open a vulnerability in terms of dependence on the foreign arms supplies. Again, what we're seeing, for instance, in Ukraine, that Ukraine, despite having some kind of a domestic defense industrial base, is still relying on the Western countries for the military assistance and in terms of the military equipment.
Sir, like since we are talking about Ukraine, so this brings me to my next question. In tandem with cybersecurity, you have also written a lot about nuclear weapons. In a nuclear weapons inventory report published this year by Swedish arms watchdog SIPRI, it is estimated that China has 50 operational warheads, while India and Pakistan have 160 and 165 operational warheads, respectively. You also cited in this report in an article that you recently wrote, where you rightly point out, and I quote, that today Southern Asia is in the midst of an arms race, and rightly so. From Russia's flexing of its nuclear weaponry early on in the Ukraine war to China's rapid extension of their nuclear arsenal, there are naturally growing worries in Asia. In this regard, how do you think India is coping with these concerns in terms of nuclear research and development? And do you think India is prepared to meet the possible challenges in the immediate future?
So, in a sense, the nuclear dynamics of Southern Asia are, in a sense, intricately linked to the larger geopolitical dynamics. And there, I think I'm flagging two important developments. One is the breakdown of the U.S. and Russia arms control negotiations, not just bilateral but also at the multilateral level. So, for instance, recently we had the NPT review conference. As you know, the NPT was indefinitely extended in 1995, and since then, the review conference, which is held every 5 years, is actually tries to produce a consensus document, which is in a sense a nuclear powers view or the nuclear weapon states view of the current geopolitical dynamics. But at this recently concluded 10th NPT review conference, the nuclear weapon states actually failed to produce a consensus document. And even though previously we have had such instances of the failure to reach a consensus, but in these times it's significant because, as many analysts have said, that we are actually in the new Cold War era, where there is, in a sense, a schism emerging between the United States led Western camp and the Russia led Eastern camp, or the Russia and China led Eastern camp. So that, in a sense, is the fundamental feature of current geopolitics, that there is a breakdown of dialogue between the United States and Russia, and that manifests also in the arms control negotiations. So even though, for instance, both the countries salvaged one existing bilateral arms control agreement, which was the New START Treaty, the way back in last year in 2021, that in a sense is not changing the larger dynamics of the US-Russia arms control and the breakdown of dialogue there. Now, combine this with what we are seeing also is the big prospects of the nuclear disarmament. So even though every country is putting especially the Western countries, or especially the US and Russia, which actually hold 90% of the current nuclear arsenal in the world, even though they are engaging in the rhetoric of nuclear disarmament, they are not taking any steps to give up their nuclear weapons. Now, the US-Russia dynamics are also driving the Chinese nuclear modernization, and whatever China is doing is also getting reflected into the Indian threat perception. So, in a sense, that is how the Indian nuclear modernization is interlinked to what is happening in the larger space. So. We had, for instance, the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, which came into effect in February 2021. But again, none of the nuclear powers are signatory to it. So even though there is a treaty which actually prohibits the possession of nuclear weapons, the countries which actually possess the nuclear weapons are not party to it. So that, in a sense, shows that even though there are these treaties which are emerging out of negotiations, they are actually becoming irrelevant to the current geopolitical reality. So it is in this context, India is undertaking the nuclear modernization, and our stated strategy is a credible minimum deterrence, which means that as second or third generation nuclear powers, we are not actually going to go for nuclear warheads in the thousands, or the nuclear arsenal into thousands of weapons. Today also, if you see, for instance, US and Russia hold nuclear warheads to the tune of 4,000 to 5,000 warheads. We are not going to do that. So currently, our strength, our nuclear arsenal is limited to 160, and I think that is, and the policymakers think that it is sufficient to actually deter our adversaries from engaging into any kind of military or nuclear mischief. So, given this credible minimum deterrence that we have, what we are also trying to achieve is a nuclear triad. So we are now having a nuclear strike capability in the land domain, in the air domain, as well as in the naval domain. And we are also consistently advancing the quality of the existing arsenal through what we call as canisterization. That we can launch the missiles through the canisters, as well as multiple independent re-entry vehicles, so the MIRV technology, so that a single warhead can fire multiple projectiles. So that, in a sense, is in a sense becoming a defining feature of India's nuclear modernization, which is reflective of what is happening in the larger space. And along with that, what we're also doing is that since 1998, or since the India-US nuclear agreement, we are in a sense emerging as one of the stakeholders in the international arms control setting. So unlike the previous approach of our diplomacy, where we used to constantly berate the Western countries for managing the arms control issues on their own. We are now actually becoming a stakeholder there, and we are ensuring, that we actually try to shape some of the rules and norms governing some of these weapon systems, as well as some the emerging technologies such as cyber, AI, blockchain, and those kind of things.